in the sorry, turn right side. MSS Rawlinson D 601 and 602 are two journals by a Huguenot in French, as you see, and they're described as journals of special diplomatic missions to Vienna in 1705, and then in the entourage of the Earl of Sunderland, and then to Portugal and Spain in 1706, where, as the catalogue says, the author was sent to the English ambassador. They're in French and are kept apparently by a French secretary, as the catalogue says, Usigny. So that's the information we have about him. The author describes in detail his journey to Vienna via the army in Flanders, where he meets Marlborough. He describes the journey to the Habsburg court. It's like a kind of grand tour diary at that point. He describes the ceremonial and musical events in the court. He describes negotiations with the Hungarian rebels in Hungary in 1705. And then in Spain, in 1706, he's embedded with the Allied army and acting as the secretary to the Earl of Galway, who was commander-in-chief of Allied forces there. And he describes the hazards of a journey from Lisbon right the way across Spain to Valencia in 1706, being shadowed all the time by the Bourbon army. So that's all very interesting, I thought, and I thought it'd be very easy to find out who this Usigny was and maybe improve this record slightly, and say give him his proper name. And especially this was the case because in the front of both those journals, he's written in January 1711, and I have reason to believe that this is when he completed these journals, because as you'll see later, he wrote that he would, if anyone came across them at some point, he would like them to be published with, as he puts it, nothing added and nothing left out. And so the journals are here, and I'm happy to show them to you in some detail later if you want to see them. But what I'm going to talk about mainly here is how we discovered who the author really is of these journals. But before we do that, I have to say that the underlined passage in here is just quite amusing in the Spanish journal. It describes actually the Portuguese army firing on a windmill in La Mancha, which the Spanish soldiers assured him was the very windmill that Don Quixote had mistaken for a giant. So I thought in this internet age it'd be easy to find Monsieur Usigny, but I looked up, I did the usual Google thing and found absolutely nothing of relevance at all. So in the end, I was forced to do the last refuge of a scandal, go back and look at the manuscript itself, and immediately realised that it didn't say Usigny at all, it said Vrigny. Could have said Urigny, but it says Vrigny. And this immediately meant that when you went back to Google, you found, first of all, I found the online version of Officials of the Secretaries of State, 1660 to 1782, includes one James Philippe Combe de Vrigny, who was a clerk in the Northern and Southern departments, and it is noted that he left office in 1702 on his appointment to the service of James Vernon, envoy to Denmark. That's quite significant, as you'll see from the book there. Now, also, various libraries have works by this Combe de Vrigny. He's in the ESTC record, although actually he's down as Combe de Urigny in there, which is a bit of a nonsense, but anyway, there we are. And so there's several works ascribed to this man. He's an author. But actually, on further investigation, which I'll cut out how I've discovered all this because there's a few minutes left, it turns out he only wrote one of those books. And ironically, it's the only one that doesn't have his name in it. And that is this one here. It's called the Relation en forme de journal d'un voyage fait en Danemark, à la suite de Monsieur l'Envoyé d'Angleterre, who of course is James Vernon, the very person that he left the secretarial point to join. So, so interestingly enough, the journals here prove that he's the author of this book, because there is some doubt about that in some records. They say it might have been written by Baron Hontin, but there's no doubt in my mind that he was the author of that book, because he alludes to his time in Denmark in the other journals, so there's no question about that. Now, the notes at the beginning of the journals, I'll show you those later on, where he says what he wants to do once these to be published, if they should be found after his death, made me go to the National Archives and look up wills in there, and hoping to find Vrigny as a writer of a will. And that turned out to be quite difficult because actually a search on Vrigny turns up absolutely nothing. So I went for his other name, Lacombe, and under Lacombe I found his father's will, which I've got here, and the father names him as a beneficiary, Philippe James de Lacombe de Vrigny. So at last we have all the names together in the one place. So that proved he was there. But I couldn't find the son's will. And the reason for that, it turned out, is the search engine for the National Archives is a little bit dodgy. If you search Lacombe, you find nothing. If you search Lacombe, two different words, there he is. And he turns up there. But interestingly enough, the name Vrigny doesn't occur in that will at all. However, it is the linchpin to everything else because it does mention an awful lot of things which are quite important. So, he's Philip James, or James Phillip in the will. And the will is dated 1711, which I thought was interesting because that's the same date as in the front of those two journals. And I also discovered his lifespan from another document, which is he was a subscriber to the Million Act in 1692, which is essentially an act to raise money for William III's war effort. At that time, he was known as Philip James de Lacombe of Utrecht in Holland. And this was in 1692, and it gives his age as 21, so we even know that from there. And this made me realise it was very unlikely he was the author of a work, which I've got a photocopy here, this Défense du Parlement d'Angleterre. Very unlikely to be the author of that work, which he is given as the author of in many, many catalogues and in lots of secondary literature. He'd be too young, but there's another reason I'll give you in just a second. Well, in fact, I think, let's cut to the chase, that work should be ascribed to another de Vrigny, somebody called Philippe Leclerc de Juigné sur de Vrigny. And I won't go into any detail about that, but the fact is that in the introduction to that work, he described himself as the grandson of Mornay du Plessis, a well-known 16th century Huguenot, and I've worked out that Leclerc is the descendant and not our de Vrigny. So our Lacombe de Vrigny appears in Bale's correspondence, which you can see online, Pierre Bale. So in August 1697, we have Janesson writing to Bale, "I am impatiently waiting the effect of Mr. Laire's promises concerning your dictionary, of which I beg you to refresh his memory. And believe me always, sir, your humble and very obedient servant. A copy has been since sent by Monsieur de Lacombe to his son, who is in Utrecht, with orders to show it to my brother." So that links him to this Bale network. There's one other reference to him there as well. We won't go into detail there. Now we know that Philip James was in Utrecht in 1697, and in the travels, in this volume here, Travels in Denmark, where he was with Vernon, it doesn't actually. He says that they were in Utrecht, and it says it doesn't. The English version and the French first edition are totally different. There's a complete passage missing from the French edition, we don't have, unfortunately. And I'll translate it for you. It says, "On March the 5th, we went to Utrecht, where Mr. Vernon was attacked by a cold, accompanied by a sore spot in one eye, which made him stay there a little longer than he had intended. We saw our friends there." Well, this immediately shows that de Vrigny and Vernon had mutual friends in Utrecht, which you can't find from the English version. And it also shows, and we know that James Vernon was a courtier, he was a diplomat, a Whig politician. He was the son of James Vernon, Secretary of State under William III. He was the envoy to Denmark in 1702 to 7, and he was educated in Utrecht. So I think they probably met in Utrecht and were already well known to each other. And I think what you're finding bit by bit here is that de Vrigny was benefiting from connections to these Whig grandees, because Vernon, I think, was the patron of his voyage to Vienna. The Earl of Sunderland was godfather to James Vernon. So there's definitely a connection going on there. But there's a lot else that can be found in de Vrigny's will, which I have over here. There's 4 pages of it. And so, as I say, it's rather odd that he should register that at the age of 39, but the reasons become very apparent. But let's just see what he had in there. He had hundreds of books, which he gives to various people, and he left £100 to Peter de Toulieu, law professor at Lingen in Westphalia. Now he's mentioned in the front of the first volume, that one, as a possible beneficiary of gifts. And it's interesting because they've spelt that name wrong in the catalogue as well, so he was also untraceable. Because what he says is, "I very humbly pray my dear cousin, de Toulieu, professor at Lingen, to whom I intend to leave most of my books and papers in my will." So he mentions his will, that is why I started looking at wills in the first place. asks him to observe what I've marked thereon, and that's dated London, 1711. But there's another name in the will, John Espinasse de Fonvive, and his writing also appears in the first volume. I'll turn to that first page eventually. Little 3 lines, and it says, "My dear friend Monsieur de Vrigny changed his mind, and by his will left me his manuscripts and various papers of his late father, signed J. de Fonvive." Now they got this wrong in the catalogue as well. They put him down as de Homsive, so he's disappeared for a little while. Fonvive is actually the editor of the Postboy, a kind of Whig journal, which is interesting in itself. But the crucial thing I want to point out here at this point is that mention of Vrigny in Fonvive's handwriting is the only reference to Vrigny in any of the published or unpublished works. So that is the linchpin, that's the keystone of the whole edifice that I've created. And they got it wrong, so that was a little bit. And another nice little story here. We also discovered, and this is thanks to Zoe Scaletti of the Voltaire Foundation, who couldn't be here today unfortunately, but she found a reference in the down here somewhere, the Journal Littéraire, I think it's a French thing that's over there. That there's a reference there to de Vrigny being a soldier, that he died in Flanders in 1711, and this makes sense of all these dates. 1711 for the will, 1711 written in the front of the volume. And so I thought, well, how are we going to? And in his will, he leaves his best horse to his brother-in-law, who's Louis Rival, an officer in the army. But that's the only evidence I had that he himself was a soldier, because it says he leaves his equipage as an officer to this Rival. And then I had this brilliant idea, which was to see if Rival's will also existed, and that absolutely clinched everything. It's extraordinary. It's a very short will, because he made it suddenly in Flanders in 1711, and the crucial point is, it's done at the Camp of Leeuwarden. The crucial thing is, he leaves his equipage to his brother, but his best horse he leaves to de Vrigny. So there's some kind of mutual pact going on here in 1711, and sure enough, both of them died out there at some point. But I'll leave the most extraordinary revelation to last, I think, and that's to do with. 10 minutes, I've had 10 minutes, right? Okay, this is it. Then I'll let you. If I can find this one, because I can't open this one. It's too tightly bound. This is a book in the Bodleian Library, and in it there is lettre écrite de Londres à Monsieur de asterisk asterisk asterisk. Anonymous work. Nobody knows who the author of this work is. Well, you all do now. You're going to find out. This is by de Vrigny, and there's 2 reasons I know this. Firstly, that journal has a transcript of the first part of this work in the back of it, and at the end, and he suddenly stops and says the rest of it's as it was published in Cologne in 1707. So that's clearly by him. Now, even if you thought you might be copying someone else's journal, perhaps, the clincher is that our copy of the work has a correction here on page 17. He's put in suivre instead of prendre. But that suivre is in de Vrigny's own handwriting. He's got a very distinctive way of writing eyes, and that's it right there. And what makes it even more interesting is that this is a copy of the British Library's version of this work. There's the same correction in the same hand. So you've got a picture of de Vrigny writing what is essentially a propaganda work, justifying the actions of the army in Spain in 1706 and the Earl of Galway. Printing these off himself, probably in Holland rather than Cologne, as the printing says Cologne, that's probably a fiction. And then sitting at his desk all night, correcting them and sending them off to his friends. So it'd be really interesting to know if there are any more of these floating around anywhere. We've slightly queered the pitch because, having told this to my Red Books colleagues, they've now linked the record for this book to that one. So they now both by de Urigny, which is the ESTC title, authority name. But eventually we'll sort that out. He'll be restored to life. And James Philippe de la Combe de Vrigny will be finally, after 130 years, he'll be back in the public domain. So that's all. Yeah.